And let's get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Sophie Ziegler. I run comms for Library Juice and all the things that Library Juice does. So I get to welcome you to events like this. I am also suffering from a slight cold, so I apologize for the way that I sound. I'm being as brave as possible. I'm so excited for today's presentation. We have a lot of interest in this topic. We have a lot of enthusiasm, so I'm so glad to be able to offer it. But before I turn it over to our speaker, I just wanted to say a couple of things about Library Juice. Starting off with Library Juice Connections, we are the events arm of everything else that Library Juice does. So Library Juice Press, as well as Library Juice Academy. So we're a central place for our events, a space to find new ways to connect, and a place of connection for all of us who are trying to think out what librarianship can be, how to think about librarianship today with all the things going on. So Library Juice includes Library Juice Press, which publishes books that examine theoretical and practical approaches to librarianship, usually from a critical angle. For an audience of professional librarians as well as students coming up in the field, Library Juice Press is an imprint of Litwin Books, so you can find more about us at litwinbooks.com. In addition to books, we also publish two academic journals, the Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies, as well as the Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship. Excuse me. So do take a look at those to see what's going on in the field, to keep abreast, and of course, to participate if these are fields that you do research in. We also have, and I know a lot of us know that and come to it from this, we also have Library Juice Academy, which is a range of online professional development courses for librarians and archivists and all of us largely in the LIS ecosystem. This is a chance for us to build new skills when we realize that, oh no, there are new things that we need to know for this job that we have. This is a great way, I think, of filling in those gaps. So most of the courses are 4 weeks. They're all asynchronous, online, taught through Moodle. We have certificates. We have institutional bundle pricing for libraries looking to sort of upskill everybody. And then, yeah, we have ways of keeping in touch after you take the classes. It's just another way that we're trying to lift each other up and build community around what it means to be a librarian again these days. Speaking of which, I hope you'll stay in touch with us. We are on all the places that you like to browse. You can find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Our YouTube channel will soon be the home of this recorded video. Please do feel free to share it after it is up. That is everything I wanted to say. I'm so excited now to turn it over to our speaker.
I am Karen Cohn, and I'm presenting Evaluating Collections for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I work at Temple University Libraries, which is in Philadelphia. So a bit about me. My job title is Collections Analysis Librarian. I've been at Temple for 10 years, and I've written 2 books. One came out 10 years ago on collection evaluation for academic libraries, and the other one's coming out next month, so I'm going to be talking about that in this presentation. And I'm also the instructor for 2 classes through Library Juice Academy. I've been teaching Introduction to Collection Analysis for about 5 years, and just recently started teaching Introduction to Collection Development. I want to point out here that I work at a university library, and the book title specifically references academic libraries. So that's always what I have in mind. And I did have one person ask me, is this presentation still relevant to other types of libraries? And I do think it is. I think the majority of what I'm saying would be applicable at a school library. But and my classes certainly have students from all types of libraries. But I do tend to, like, my examples will be academic because that's what I'm familiar with. So this presentation is specifically about evaluation for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is abbreviated as DEI. And I imagine you have an idea what it means. You're certainly hearing about it in the news. But I think it's helpful to go over the definition because your understanding of the concept can affect the action steps that you take after doing an evaluation. When people talk about DEI, they often use it interchangeably with diversity, and I'm going to do that too in this presentation. But diversity is really a component of DEI, not the whole picture. Diversity just means difference. And we're all taught, and I remember learning in library school about the value of including a lot of different things in the collection, particularly different viewpoints on different issues. But when people use the word diversity, especially when it's paired with equity and inclusion, they're referring to systemic inequality. So people who are in non-dominant groups in the society and who often get left out of the stories that are told. So who these people are varies depending on what society you're in. For instance, a book about the history of Japan might be common in Japan, but not common in the US. And the idea of dominant groups is where equity comes in. Equity involves looking at structures that create or maintain inequality. Promoting equity could mean buying books about these structures, about poverty or racism, for instance, but it also could mean thinking about the systems within the library and the systems that you interact with, such as the publishing world or your approval plans, the ways you do selection, and how those affect what stories end up in your collection. And inclusion has to do with how we integrate diversity. So one thing that is a common criticism of diversity at the university level is that universities often make an effort to recruit and admit people from diverse backgrounds, and then these students might go through college not feeling like they belong because they don't see faculty who look like them, or they don't know some of the language of academia if they're first generation college students. So then they're not fully included. Sorry, my notes are on a printed paper, so there's going to be a little page turning here. Within the library, inclusion could mean soliciting student feedback on purchases so that the students are included in the process of developing the collection. It could also mean changing how you do selection so that books highlighting minority groups are an integral part of your collecting practice. That's another form of including rather than just an add-on, inclusion in the selection process. Sometimes accessibility is included in these initials, so then it becomes DEIA. And accessibility is really important. So I do want to note it, but I'm not going to discuss it. And that's partly because it's not something I know as much about. And also it needs to be looked at differently from DEI because it relates to the format of the material and how they're accessed rather than the work that is, the content or the material itself. So as you know, universities across the United States are being asked to stop having DEI programs. And a lot of libraries, I think, want to still do DEI work, but sometimes I've heard some people are trying to find ways to do the work and not publicize it or talk about it differently. So I want to suggest that if you're trying to do work related to DEI, when you can't publicize that this is what you're doing, you might use language that instead names the reasons you're doing it. So this slide serves two purposes. I'm going to talk about reasons a diverse collection matters, and also how those reasons can provide language to talk about what you're doing. So one reason would be to support your courses. Hold on. For instance, if you have an Asian studies program, or you have a social work class on working with immigrants, a class on teaching English language learners, you would want materials that support these classes. Supporting the curriculum isn't the only reason to have a diverse collection, but I think it may be the least controversial reason, unless the programs themselves become controversial. Another academic goal could be preparing students for a global society. This sounds kind of corporate, especially if you make it about the workforce and workplace skills, and it also avoids mentioning inequality. So this might not be like in your heart what your goal is, but it could be practical to use that language. The next two goals are written in a way that seems kind of vague, but they are important. So one of them is helping students learn about all different people, and another is serving the full student population. So I want to note that one of these is about learning about others, and the other is allowing people to see themselves reflected. And which of these you prioritize, I think is going to depend a lot on how diverse your student body. So one of these might make more sense than the other. If your student body is really homogeneous, you want to focus on people learning about more diversity than what they would encounter in school. Whereas if the student body is pretty diverse, your concern might be more that people should see themselves reflected. I'm on a DEI and collections committee at my library, and we have not been asked to change any of our projects or keep them under the radar. So I haven't tested these strategies of how not to talk about DEI, luckily. But I hope that the ideas help if you do need to do that. So one thing I encountered when I started learning about assessment for diversity and inclusion, and I have thought this myself, is like, well, why do we need to do an assessment? Because we kind of already know our collections aren't very diverse. And there's definitely a case for wanting to start with some sort of action to expand your collection. Just start with buying more rather than starting with assessing what you have. And it's true that assessment doesn't need to be the first step, but there are some reasons that it can be helpful. One is to identify areas of weakness. So if you're using assessment as a starting point and you're comparing your coverage of certain populations to others or some parts of the collection to others, the assessment could help you know where to focus your first changes. Another goal is to motivate improvement. So it may surprise you just how few books you have on a certain group, and this having a number could motivate you. Communicating about the collection. Data is often a tool for describing your collection to others, maybe with a potential donor or with selectors within your web. You can also avoid overestimating the effect of your efforts. So you might have done something that you feel good about, like working with a student group or working with a class to help select books, and you feel excited about this. And it's good, to feel happy with what you're doing. But those purchases are probably minimal compared to what you buy in a given year. So the assessment can give you that perspective. But at the same time, you want to be able to recognize progress. So um, if you have an assessment that can be repeated year to year, this will help you track your progress so that you can have that additional motivation of affirmation that you've made some difference. And lastly, measuring affects behavior. So this is an abstract but significant reason. I read an article that mentioned the fact that like wearing some kind of step tracker encourages people to increase the number of steps they take. And I tend to bring that up a lot now when I talk about assessment, because really when you're measuring something, you end up changing your behavior to improve the measurement. I also was thinking of the Goodreads challenge, and maybe it's another example of that. I might encourage you to read more. There's a guest chapter in my book that describes an assessment project where the library analyzed their purchases each year. And the number of books related to the aspects of diversity that they were measuring went up a lot. And I asked them, because I was editing the chapter, I said, like, was there a change in your purchasing patterns and your selection? Because this would be important to add in your chapter. And they said, no, it was just the fact that we were measuring caused us to do our purchasing differently. So, and it made a big change. So I think that that's a strong case, I think. So what are we measuring? So I defined DEI in general, but in order to implement an assessment, you need to be very specific about what you're measuring. Many studies focus on race, I think because race is just a really significant type of inequality in the US. I found that a lot of people don't give a reason why they decided to focus on race, but I think it feels kind of obvious. But there are other types of diversity. So there's like sexuality, gender diversity, disability, immigration status, for example. One thing to keep in mind is that a group doesn't need to be in the minority to be considered underrepresented. So women are a slight majority in higher education in terms of student numbers, but they might not be well represented in your library collection. The traits that you want to measure, I alluded to this earlier, the traits may or may not be related to your student body. For instance, a Hispanic serving institution might want to look at how many books they had about Hispanic or Latino people. They might also be interested in immigration. But a really homogeneous school might be trying to help students learn about people that they're not doing that at school. It also might relate to your role in the library. So if you work, for instance, with the Latin American Studies program and you are the one doing an assessment, you might want to focus on books that support that program. So in that case, the reason for choosing something also it probably will feel obvious to you. But remember that there's diversity within Latin America and probably within other area studies as well. So you might want to also look for books about indigenous groups or LGBT people, for instance. And as you'll see in a bit, there will be a lot of examples of this. The methodologies themselves will influence how many traits you can study. So some methodologies lend themselves to looking at a lot of different traits, like multiple races, multiple LGBTQ identities, and some are better for just focusing on one or two. A significant question that you want to think through is whether you're interested in the content of the materials or who wrote them. Most studies look at content, but there are reasons for both. The content of the work is more visible to your patrons. So if your motivation is about people learning about people different from themselves, they would probably do this through the content of the books. And if your goal is to support the curriculum, looking at content would also make the most sense. Also, assessing the content is much easier than authorship because the information is already in the catalog. We have subject headings, maybe table of contents or other content notes. Assessing authorship is a lot more complicated, but it can be worthwhile for a few reasons. One is that many people feel that someone's positionality affects the perspective that they have on the world. And so reading books by diverse people would be inherently valuable. In particular, if you're assessing a collection that's focused on a specific group, like an Indigenous Studies collection, it's important that a significant amount of the collection be written by members of the group so that they can be described in their own voices. And lastly, because the publishing world is so wide, and it is generally recognized that minorities face barriers at various stages to becoming published authors, seeking out those works that have been published and buying them if they fit your other selection criteria can help even the score a little bit. Staff can be very uncomfortable categorizing authors by their identities. This could involve looking up personal information that isn't connected to their professional work. And it could also raise questions about how to categorize historical figures who didn't think of their identities in the same categories that we do today, particularly sexuality and gender identity. But it is possible to come up with thoughtful and ethical guidelines. And I'm going to share a citation later to an article that talks about how to. Another important thing that I want you to be aware of is intersectionality. And I want to try to explain what it is, even though it's pretty hard to measure. The concept is developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, and the main idea is that when people belong to multiple marginalized groups, the discrimination they experience is not the sum of the discrimination against each group. People commonly use this term just as a way of acknowledging that people can be marginalized in multiple ways, and they're not always familiar with the arguments that Crenshaw makes. So I do like to explain those to the extent that, I understand them. Crenshaw was writing about legal situations, and her article mentioned several court cases that were related to an employer who hired Black people and hired women, but didn't hire any Black women. And the courts were saying, well, there's no gender discrimination because there's women who work here. She didn't give the details of, and I didn't look up the cases, but they were all related to manufacturing. And so I can easily picture like there might have been Black men on the shop floor and white women at the reception desk. I mean, that's the way I'm imagining it. So she was arguing that the intersection of these two identities is its own distinctive experience. And another piece of her theory is that analysis of marginalized groups tends to focus on the most privileged people within that group. So the example that I thought of was when I think of early feminist movements or second-wave feminist movements, that they've been criticized for focusing on wealthy, white, straight women. So that would be the most privileged people within the marginalized group of women. When people talk about intersectionality now, they usually mean making sure that they pay attention to those who are most marginalized. I haven't seen people apply this to library collections. So what I tend to say is my explanation of how it applies is that if you count the number of books you have on LGBTQ people and you count the number of books about Black people, you don't know if you have books about Black LGBTQ people, right? And you might or may not. Only one of the methods that I'm going to talk about lets you measure intersectionality. And even then, it isn't perfect. Of course, people are not just a sum of traits. And there's always going to be a finite number of traits that you can measure. But it's useful to keep in mind that you don't want all the books about Black people to be about men. You don't want all the LGBTQ books to be about white people, especially white men. So I think it's always a good concept to understand and think about. So on to actually how to do the assessment. I'm going to take another sip of tea before I proceed. The literature on DEI assessment is really in development. It feels like there's new articles coming out all the time. But in general, there are three methods, and I'm going to go into more detail about each of these on later slides. But here are the definitions. So list checking involves finding or creating a list of recommended books and checking the catalog to see if the library has them. Often this is a list of awards, and there are awards that exist for both children's books and adult books. You could also use a bibliography or a list that you compile yourself from multiple sources. Metadata searching or catalog searching involves figuring out all the call numbers or subject terms related to various populations, and then searching the catalog to see how many titles there are. The result is just a count. It's just a number of titles or items. Diversity coding involves taking a sample from your collection and looking at each book or the record for each book so that you can assign codes. And the codes are something you create locally. You make your own coding guide depending on what traits you want to look for. And I will have examples of all of these coming up. So this is an example of list checking, and it's from an article by Laurel Christic. She looked at 7 different demographic groups. I didn't put them all on the slide just because the font would get too small. Most of her lists were lists of award winners, but she found that there were and I've seen this as well, there were very few awards related to disability. So she created a checklist herself using reference works. I think she looked at books that were mentioned in reference works. And the result is a percentage of each list. So in theory, the way this should work, I think, is that you could use the percentages to decide where to focus further purchasing. What I have seen is that the numbers of titles are so different that looking at percentages kind of doesn't make sense. So like the number of books on Arab Americans is really low. There were only 64 titles on the list. And so having 33%, even though that number is well in line with the others, that probably doesn't feel like enough, right? I mean, it's still very few books. And then conversely with LGBTQ, it's actually the lowest percentage, but it's the highest number of books. So really, if you want to compare percentages, you need your lists to be of similar sizes. So that can be an issue. But you don't need to, you might not have a goal of comparing, it might just be descriptive. There are some awards that recognize intersectional identities, but they're rarely enough that you could use this method to make a whole list. So like there are awards for books about Black women, for instance, but I don't think there are enough that you could easily make a list of just books about Black women. I mean, you could probably compile your own list from different sources if that was important to you. All of these methods have advantages and shortcomings. So list checking is a very simple process, and I think it's funny to note that when I was telling my sisters about the book, one of my sisters said, I don't mean to be offensive, but I don't understand how you wrote a whole chapter about that. Like you just take the list and look up in the catalog and see if you have the books. I was like, I get it. The process itself is very simple. It's more about figuring out what list you want to use and how to create it. List checking is useful for assessing topics that are spread out across the collection, which is true of almost all DEI assessments, that there's not going to be just one call number range that you could check to see, where are all the books about Asian people or whatever group. So list checking works well for that, for getting things that are in different call numbers across the collection. It's also easy to turn the assessment into action steps. You would just buy the books on the list that you don't have. If you do this, though, you can't repeat the assessment the next year using the same list because you would have everything. It's kind of like teaching to the test. And you'd get a perfect score because you just went and bought all the books. You could repeat list checking if you had a different list year to year. Some downsides are that the lists themselves are uneven, as you saw on the previous slide. There were a lot more awards for some populations than others. In particular, there are a ton of awards for LGBTQ. There's just a lot of subcategories of the Lambda Literary Awards. There are also very few DEI awards for science and business, and very few for disability, as I said. So it could take extra work to make sure that you're covering both a range of disciplines and a range of identities. One thing that tends to happen when you think of awards is people think of literature, and you don't want your awards to only be literary awards, and you want diversity across other topics as well. The list itself only covers a small portion of the collection. And what I mean by this is you really should have more books about all of your target groups than what's on the list. It's not giving you a full picture of the collection. There also might be some books that you have that should be weeded, and this method won't tell you that. And I've heard some concern that using lists of recommended or award-winning books sets a higher standard for books about marginalized people, as it implies that the library would only be buying those books if they won awards. But you don't have to only buy books that have won awards. The assessment tool isn't going to be the only thing that affects your purchasing in the future. Another shortcoming is you can't compare your findings to the student body. The result shows you what percentage of books on the list you have, but it doesn't make sense to compare that to how many of your students are Arab or African American or any other identity. You might not have that as one of your goals anyway, and so that wouldn't be an issue. So here are a few resources. The Christic article I mentioned earlier, and then the second one is a link to a guide to book awards for adults. Melissa wrote one of the guest chapters in my book. I should say I wrote 9 chapters myself that are explaining diversity and how to measure it and then describing the different methods. And then I have 3 guest chapters that are from other librarians talking about specific projects that they did. And Melissa has a lot of information in her guides online, and so a lot of people rely on her list of book awards and her other guides related to assessment. So in her chapter, she describes how she compared her own holdings to the lists of award winners. And you can use her guide either to make a list for list checking, so you look up the awards and then look up who won them and make your list, or you could just use it as a selection tool, just buy the books. She also wrote about how she used resources for college libraries. This is an online subscription tool, and it's geared towards undergraduate libraries. She uploaded her library's holdings and then compared them to RCL's recommended lists on various topics. And because the lists actually change every year, she's been able to repeat that assessment year to year. So you can read more about her work on her website or in my book. This is an example of what a metadata search would give you. These are from 2 searches that I did at my library on 2 different occasions. In its simplest form, the results are just a number. That metadata searching is just going to produce a number of titles. You can choose to analyze your results by breaking them down by decade or classification range. We ended up looking at the books about North American Indigenous people by call number range, and we found they were almost all in history, which was interesting. And that mostly has to do with just how the LC classification system, where it puts them. In this example, I would imagine looking by decade would be useful because even though there's a lot more books on North American Indigenous people, my guess would be that these books are a lot older than the LGBTQ books, and that this area probably actually needs more attention because there's nobody actively collecting in that area. So that's not a typical piece of metadata searching, but it's doable. I don't think it's hard to add, and it lets you get more value out of the assessment. The second example I have here is from Melissa Gonzalez, who I mentioned on the last slide. She did a few different types of analysis. One of them involved using the Green Glass software to get counts of books in specific call number ranges. So she had, and Green Glass includes ranges that cover African Americans, people with disabilities, immigration. Call number ranges can be, are probably on their own not the best way, I think, to analyze a collection. Not if you're doing a DEI analysis, because there might be books in a variety of different disciplines that would be in a variety of different call number ranges, but Green Glass is an efficient way to do it. I wanted to share the search strategy that I used for the search on Native Americans because I have a couple of points I want to make about it. One is that it's a lot of terms, and I used Alma Analytics. You may recognize the screenshot if you're an analytics user. So that I was able to put them all in at once, and I could even have done more, but this is not every subject heading that exists. My colleague Andrea chose to use the broader terms, such as Indians of North America, and terms for local tribes like the Lenape and the Delaware Indians. We wouldn't really expect to have much on specific tribes that aren't local, so we decided that the search string didn't need to be comprehensive, but it's still pretty long. Another point is that the words you see here, I think almost all of them are not words that these people would use to refer to themselves, particularly the word Indians. So I want to point out that when I presented the results on the previous slide, I used North American Indigenous people. When I did the search, I had to use the terms that were in the subject headings. So this would be a strategy that you could copy as well. When someone is doing the search, particularly if you're like giving a list of terms to a student worker, for instance, it's good to warn the person that they're probably going to encounter some terms that are offensive to them, and that they might be uncomfortable with this. I've read in other studies that it's helpful to just give people a chance to talk about how it's upsetting to keep coming across things that are offensive. But you also can be judicious about who sees these terms. You don't have to share all these words when you're sharing the end result, which is that, just that number. So this leads into advantages and shortcomings. An advantage is you can evaluate the whole collection rather than a sample of the collection. And the search can be done quickly once you've created the search string, which also makes it easy to repeat the search annually and track improvement. The search also produces results that you can compare to your student body. For instance, if 10% of your student body is African American, but 5% of the books relate to African Americans, then that would tell you that you probably want more. But as I've said, you might not have a goal of getting the numbers to exactly match, particularly if your student body is not very diverse. For shortcomings, as the example illustrates, this method requires you to focus on just a few populations. You can imagine it took some time to come up with a search string for one, and we could only run one search at a time. So these types of searches of assessments tend to be more limited in scope. The results also just tell you a number, and so you don't know if the books are outdated or inaccurate or otherwise should be weeded. Some books are hard to identify with metadata. For instance, if something is in a new field, search terms are not created in the Library of Congress subject headings until there are already books on it. So the early books might not have the search terms applied. And someone could apply them retroactively, but it's not going to be 100%. And as we saw, the terminology could be outdated or offensive. So the people working on searches need to feel somewhat prepared for that, at least a warning. This is the method that has the least written about it. It doesn't seem to be a method that's used all that often, but there's one really useful resource. This article, it's like a normal length article, but it has a very long appendix that you can find in their repository. And it lists every call number related to African Americans or LGBTQ people. And they go to the level of, if there's a call number in the literature section for a specific person, like James Baldwin, they'll have his call number. So, and they also include, I know one thing they include is things like jazz music or sickle cell anemia that are strongly associated with African Americans, even though they're not explicitly about them. So it's very long and very detailed, and that would allow someone to do a meta search. So for diversity coding, here's an example from one of my coworkers, and she did a study of books about World War II in the collection. She looked at a sample. You can see the total number here at the bottom. Her sample was just 250 books. And you can see that you can get some idea here of what her coding guide was, in that she chose topics related to what was of interest to her and what was relevant to this study. So there's this category called Holocaust, yes, no, which probably wouldn't be included in most diversity audits, but was very relevant to the World War II analysis. She also, you can see that there's a lot of traits here, more than we saw in the metadata search, certainly. She didn't make a note of like which race or which sexuality was mentioned in the book. And this made sense in her case because the numbers were really low. It just wasn't, it was only 1.2% of the books were about sexuality in any way, 10% about non-white people. Most of the time when people do diversity coding, they do include different codes for specific races or specific LGBTQ letters. You also, I hope you can see here that it is possible to use this method to consider intersectionality. Like what you can see here is just a cross tab of like, if these books were about Eastern Europe and they were about non-white people versus about Asia and about non-white people. But it would have been possible, I didn't do this, but to create something that showed the intersection of like non-white and gender or non-white and sexuality. So this is the only method that lets you do that, in a quantifiable way, look at intersectional identities. So an advantage, as I've said, is that this method is really flexible because it lets you create the codes yourself and you define the categories that are of interest to you. Rebecca's codes were very specific to what made sense for her study. You can also code for a lot of traits at once, and you can account for intersectionality. You might also come across candidates for weeding because this method involves looking more closely at specific books. You don't want to let that derail your project, partly because you want to keep moving forward and finish it, but also because it kind of skews your results if you weed while you're in the middle of the analysis. But you can make a note of what books to come back to later. You can use information beyond what's in your catalog. For instance, you could look up a table of contents, you could read an ebook preview, and you would especially want to do this if you wanted to code for author identities. This is the one method that lets you code for author identities. The shortcomings are closely related to the advantages. Creating a coding guide is time consuming. Pretty much for all of these, one of the shortcomings is just that it takes time. So really they all take time. Creating external information is time consuming. I think this may be the most time consuming of the methods. And because of the time it takes to look at individual books, you can only code a pretty small number, and it always relies on sampling. So I mentioned before that I could share some guidance on coding author identities. A lot of people who do diversity coding projects use Emerson and Lehman as a model because they were really thoughtful about the types of data they used and how they coded. For instance, they were careful to say that if someone was known to be in an opposite sex relationship, we don't know that they're exclusively heterosexual. We only know about the relationship that they're in. So they would code someone as opposite sex relationship if that's the information they had. Or they would code someone as using she, her pronouns. We don't know how strongly they think of themselves as a woman, but we know what pronouns they use. They also relied on information that comes directly from the author or information that would be easy for the author to challenge. For instance, something an interviewer said in their presence. I have more about this in my book. I have a whole table of what I feel are acceptable sources of information, what might be acceptable and what's not. In particular, the main thing is don't use photos to guess at someone's race or gender. But I really want to credit Lauren and Maria for helping me to start thinking about this, about ethically coding author identities. So the citations here are both a journal and a toolkit. And then the third one is a coding guide. And I saw this guide, it was cited in an article, and I went and looked at it. And then I contacted Ruth and Artemis and asked if they would write a chapter in my book. So it was kind of perfect because their guide was really good, but they hadn't written it up yet. So you can read more in my book about how they implemented the guide, or you could just go use their guide as a model. So I mentioned before that the method will affect scope, and I think you are starting to see that, hopefully. There are a few other factors that affect scope, and I have these wheels up here kind of illustrating that. So one thing would be how much you can analyze depends on how much time you have to do it. And the time depends on staff. So if we'd had two people coding the books on World War II, we probably could have done 500 books in the amount of time it took one person to do 200, for instance. The scope can vary a lot, and every assessment is going to be limited in some way. I mean, everything I saw, everything that I showed as an example, if you had to define the scope, you would see it's not every aspect of diversity in every part of the library. So one way to limit will be by subject area. At my library, the social work liaison did a project where she looked at only books related to social work and social services, and then she looked at Asian identities within that collection. So specific area and a particular population. I've also seen studies that were done only on the play collection or only on recent American fiction. Many studies look only at purchases in the last year. This can make a lot of sense if you want to repeat the analysis and track progress. Particularly also if you're looking at author identities, you might want to limit to recent books because it would be harder to find information on older authors. Location, what I mean by location is that there are studies that look at just the fiction collection or the juvenile collection, something that's already a distinct section of your library. And I think if you were in like a school or public library, I think there are more different locations, so that that goal might make sense there. And also looking at select populations. So if you're doing list checking, for instance, you might only do 2 lists if that was all you had time for. If it's metadata searching, you might create a search string related to African Americans and stop there. Or you might, another thing you can do is like start with one and then expand the scope if you have the time or you're finding it useful. There is also sampling, and I didn't list this as a way to limit scope because only one method relies on sampling, and that method always uses sampling. But sampling makes it really easy to adjust the scope because you can change the size of your sample. So my coworker, Rebecca, started with 10 books. I mean, not 10, she started with 100 books. And then went on and continued and got up to 250. You will also almost always exclude some locations or some item types. We usually leave out government documents because we don't select these individually. We're a depository library, and so we're not choosing which GovDocs we acquire. You might also look only at books and not journals. You probably would leave out microfilm. Um, you might leave out juvenile books, or you might only do juvenile books. There's also it's also possible to do an analysis of music scores. I think that would mostly look at authorship rather than content, but so you could look only at one item type, or you could filter out particular item types. Oh, I want to take away from this slide to be that you can do this at a large library. I've seen it said a lot that it's hard to do assessment at a large library, and I don't know that I quite see why that is. I mean, some of these methods are not any different depending on the size of your library. List checking and metadata searching, the process would be the same at a large library than a smaller one. For the coding, you would probably need to limit more. So the example I showed was only books about World War II, and she only coded 250 books. So it's a little piece, you know. She did intend to do more, but actually don't know that if she had done more, I don't know that it would have changed her results very much. So I would say if it's a large library, you might just tackle it by looking at a few pieces and then putting the bigger picture together over time. So I said at the beginning that there are three methods, and I want to present this unofficial fourth method that I also think is important, that I'm calling evaluating efforts. This means instead of looking at what you own, your focus is on the work you're doing. So that might mean setting goals and then assessing how the work went or studying existing processes, and I'll have more examples on the next slide. The reason that people choose to focus on efforts is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people do feel like, well, we already know our collection isn't diverse enough, so it doesn't make sense to start by assessing it. And also, as you saw, all of these methods have their shortcomings, so if those feel too significant to you, this is a way to still do some form of assessment. But also people who do assessment of the collection may combine it with assessment of efforts because there are other reasons that it's valuable. One is that the collection is not going to significantly change until some processes and mindsets change. So it could make sense to look directly at the process. And also the collection is about more than what you own. The way that it's cataloged and displayed affect how users perceive it. So looking at your efforts lets you take that into account as well. Here are some examples of ways you might assess efforts. These are questions that you would ask yourselves, not about what you have, but about how you do things. For instance, does your policy mention or allude to DEI? How long do non-English books take to get on the shelves compared to books in English? I know at my library, they can take a lot longer. Do you have guides for books on disability or other topics? And a topic that there's starting to be some guides written about is dermatology books related to darker skin, and we do have one. Do your selections and tools include any that are focused on specific marginalized populations, and can you add some? How have you promoted your DEI projects to the campus, and can you increase promotion? So maybe taking an inventory of your efforts. The goal, as before, the goal is not to beat yourself up, but to notice where you are, track improvement, similar to the goals of the earlier assessment. And also, like the other methods, these keep diversity and inclusion at the forefront of your mind. This, as I said earlier, how measuring will affect your behavior. So working on a project to evaluate some efforts could affect your selection, even if you don't have that as a specific goal. The assessment here is more informal. You can see that a lot of these are actually yes or no questions, but you wouldn't just answer no and then be done with it. Of course, the question would be a starting point. You'd follow it with a goal to make a change, and then later you would probably reflect on the process of how the process of change had gone. For instance, were you finding it helpful to have additional selection tools? Do they seem like the right tools? Are your new guides getting used? There would be additional assessment of how the changes had gone. And of course, the purpose of assessment of any type of assessment is to make changes. It's not the focus of this presentation, but I wanted to put a few ideas on this slide just because it would be silly to not mention them. So of course, seeking new selection tools, possibly working with student groups to get ideas of other changes you can make or books you could buy, just buying the items from your checklists, seeking out a BIPOC-owned bookstore that you could support, or making focused displays and guides. So some of these relate to the collection, to selection and purchasing, and some of them relate to how the collection is shared and users' experience of the collection. There's more of all of this in my book. It's coming out in just about a month from Bloomsbury. And as a reminder, so these are the two classes that I teach through Library Juice. Neither is on this topic specifically, but the analysis class is what led me to learn more about diversity assessment. My students were asking me, my students were saying they were interested in this. They were asking if I knew anything, and I felt a responsibility to have something to share with them. So I went and learned, and that resulted in me writing a book. That class is tools focused, so it could help with an assessment project as well because it involves a lot of Excel skills. And the collection development class mentions diversity and ways to keep it in mind when selecting this. So there, here are all the references. These are just the links that came up throughout the presentation. And it looks like we have some time for questions. I wanted to preemptively apologize if I have any former students here and I don't recognize your name because it's hard to remember people after the course has ended. But at a glance, I didn't see any names I recognized. So I think, should I just look at the Q&A and see what's already there?
Yeah, you can definitely do that. You'll see we have a couple of questions about sharing slides.
Yeah, it seems like they're all related to slides so far. Okay. Are there any other questions? They're really all about the slides. I hadn't been asked about that, but I can send the slides to Sophie.
Yeah, that's right. If you're willing to share the slides, we can include a link to those at the same time we provide a link to the recording.
Okay. I think people are starting to leave already, so maybe they don't have questions, but we can wait a little bit and see if any come up.
One just came in.
Oh. Yeah, English literature is an interesting question. Hmm. I'm trying to think. I mean, I think that award winners, it's interesting because I mentioned like one of the things to be alert for with awards is that people always assume you're looking at literature. And we had to do a little bit of reminding people at my library that award winners don't only mean literary awards. But if you want to look at literature, I think picking particular book awards and then checking to see if you have the winners would be a good way to go about it. And then the diversity coding as well. And I think I would guess with literature that may be a case where you're more interested in authorship than some other subjects. But diversity coding, you could do that with literature as well and limit it. You might limit to like newer literature or older literature. I don't think metadata searching would work well. And I mean, I try to present all the methods evenly, but like metadata searching is not done very often. It's you get information from it, but it not as much as you get from some of the other methods. So yeah, I think you could definitely make a list of various award winners, and you would want to try to see if your list could be balanced so that it wasn't like all LGBTQ, because there are just a lot of awards for that. You would also want to check there's like the two disability awards. There's some Native American book awards, Arab American, there's Jewish book awards. So yeah, I think list checking or diversity coding could work for sure. Oh, okay. So, oh, there's my FedEx delivery. I knew I was going to get a knock on the door during the session. Um, I think it can wait 10 minutes. Do I mark things as answered or should I just talk and have you mark things?
We can mark things as answered if you
Okay. So the English literature one, I'm saying answer live. So there's a question about if you're explicitly told you can't do DEI related work. I mean, I have been really lucky. I just earlier this week emailed my dean to warn him that I had this book coming out that might be controversial, and he was really supportive of it. And our committee hasn't been asked to change anything. Um, I think that it probably makes a difference who is telling you not to do it, if it's someone within the library or someone outside, because if the library wants to be supportive, but it can't, it can't be publicized, that's an easier situation. I also think if you're someone who likes giving conference presentations, like you can't present on work that you have been told not to do, probably. Last fall I was talking to someone from Florida. I forget which university, but I was saying, I think we all need to learn from you people in Florida, of like what have you been doing to try to do your DEI work? And she kind of said make it topical, like if you are reviewing your leadership collection, presented as we did an assessment of our leadership collection, um, and just in your heads, you might be looking at diversity within the leadership collection. So that was one suggestion that I got from someone, and I think that might help. Like to go back to the previous question about English literature, like you could just say we're doing an assessment of our English literature collection. It's just a question of like who can you share the results with, and who can you not share them with? Who can you be honest about sharing them with? And I would hope that within the library you could share that information. Music collections. So there's a question about how I would approach music collections. Um, I I'm trying to think. I did at one point see a list of um, Black classical composers, and well, it was not an assessment project. It was a totally different project, but I was supposed to like check to see what we had by these people in our collection. So I think that and I think there might have been a list of women composers. So I would say like you could look for that, and then if you're looking at scores, then check to see what you have. So that would be list checking. I don't know about diversity coding because it's so much harder to find information about like author identity or composer identity if the person is alive and if they've been alive in the era of social media. And but you could try that for newer music collections. Yeah, I think that's probably the extent of what I know about music, but that's something. Okay, 5 minutes. Interesting question about if everything is focused on a marginalized group and everything has low checkout. I always feel like in collection development, there's a little bit of a tension between should I just be promoting this more to get it used, or should I be reading it because it's not being used? So it seems like in your circumstance, maybe promoting it more if you can. But I also wonder, do you have low checkout stats because people are just using things in-house because you said it's a special library? Um, I wonder if it's similar to like reading a reference collection where you just don't have the usage stats. I don't think I have that much I can say in response to that question. I have kind of some more questions for you about why the stats are low or who your users are. I know that on our DEI committee, we really see promoting the work we do as part of the work. Because like how much does it help to be, we buy books from a local Black-owned bookstore, and if our goal is to make our students feel that we're representing them in the collection, it helps for them to know that we're doing it. Um, so I think you could do the more like the evaluating your efforts, try to do more promotion and then see if it affects the reading. I mean, affects the circ. Sorry, I don't have that much to say about that. So someone asked about benchmarks, and this person actually said, I don't have a question formulated yet, but I'm going to try to answer that a little bit because I do mention that in the book that you're not. So like in my first book, which was about just general collection evaluation, I talked about benchmarking and comparing yourself to peer libraries. But when it comes to diversity, there probably isn't a library that you want to compare yourself to. Like who has the perfect amount of diversity in their library? I think probably none of us are good enough, but we also might have slightly different goals depending on our student populations. So the only time I've seen benchmarks really is when it's an analysis year to year and they're looking at improvement. Um, so that's what I would say about benchmarking. 2 minutes. So this question about metadata searching, um, would there be a benefit to pulling all the records and then using that to search the metadata versus using the entire catalog? So one thing that happens with metadata searching is that it can be very useful to get all your results in an Excel spreadsheet and then go through it if you can, if it's not an enormous list, go through it and look for things that came up in your search that actually aren't relevant. And so the way you're first envisioning it, pull all the records. I kind of think this depends on the size of your collection. But if your collection is not too big, it could help to pull all the records because then you might not have to worry as much about identifying keywords. You can just look at them and see, does this seem like it's about this population? And then you would just remove ones that weren't relevant. Another thing is that the one that I mentioned that was about social work, where my coworker was looking at books about social work, she was interested in books that mentioned like Asian people or any specific Asian country or ethnic group, even if it was in the content note, and we had to make a change to Alma Analytics to make it possible to search on that content note. So I do think if you were able to pull all the records, then you could search within all fields. But at the same time, I will say that I didn't find it very useful. Like if it's going to mention, China in the content note, but it's not in the subject terms, that book doesn't say all that much about China. And otherwise there would be a subject heading for it. So I don't know that it's completely necessary to search all fields, but that is a benefit of being broad in what you initially pull and then being able to go through your spreadsheet. But I think if you like, because my library has about 3 million books, um, for us, it would make sense to do some filtering and, not start with a spreadsheet of everything, but everything during a certain time period could be doable. Okay. Okay, I'm going to try to quickly answer this one last question, and it's the last one I see from Rebecca LaRue about physical and electronic. Yeah, so for the Native American ones, I did compare the years. Like I generally expect ebooks to be newer. So that would be probably some difference. Another thing about electronic materials is that if you're doing diversity coding, you can look at the book and you can read the acknowledgement section and see like people thank their spouse. That sometimes gives you an idea if you're coding for sexuality, gives you some idea of their relationship. They don't always use a pronoun for their spouse, and so you can't always tell for sure. But being able to read sections of the book can help a lot with diversity coding. So that would be a difference. I know that like we're for now still using Oasis from ProQuest for ordering, and in Oasis, even if we have a print book, but we don't have the ebook, we can often still preview the ebook. So that might be an option, even if you're evaluating your physical collections, you might be able to look at an ebook preview and look at additional information. But yeah, I generally think the difference for electronic would be that they're probably newer and you can see more. You can always see the table of contents, and you could read sections of it. It's also, we found it harder to weed out government documents from electronic, but I don't have that much to say about that. I think they had like they all had the same item type in the physical catalog, but the electronic ones were spread out over a variety of collections, so we weren't able to remove those from the search or from the analysis.
All right.
Okay, I'm a little bit over time, and I think I did get to all the questions.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.